Hi, Ben. I am a fan, but I'm in the disagree category.
Well, that's fine. Okay.
There are studies which show young children find black babies dirty or not nice, and that culturally black names on resumes and job applications get fewer callbacks. Do you think this is an example of systematic racism?
Well, I'm not going to accuse a 3-year-old of systematic racism. So let's start with that. I don't think that babies necessarily have the capacity to build an entire hierarchy of race. Like, I have a 4.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and they can barely clean themselves. And the 2.5-year-old can't clean himself. So if he's a racist, I have yet to see it manifest, and he's not like burning a tiny cross in the front yard or anything. As far as the studies that show the culturally black names being hired at a lesser rate, there's actually a fascinating study that was done about last names. So the question when it came to the first name study was, are people being ruled out because of race, or are they being ruled out because of perception of culture? And this makes a difference because you have what Thomas Sowell calls discrimination, and then he basically has discrimination A and discrimination 1A, and then he has discrimination B. So discrimination B is open racism. You're black, I'm not hiring you because I think you're inferior, right? That's, everyone can agree is racist. Discrimination 1, right, which is basically the idea that I discriminate in my daily life between any number of choices. I'm going to discriminate today about whether I feel like having a hamburger or whether I feel like having a cheese sandwich. It doesn't have any moral content to the discrimination. And then Sowell talks about discrimination 1A. And this is where you don't have the information about the individual necessary to make a highly specific decision about that individual. So instead, you use the best group indicators available. So for example, he uses the example of criminal record. President Obama in office tried to pass a regulation, that the federal government could not, and federal contractors could not, in hiring, take into account previous criminal record. What this resulted in was the hiring of fewer black people, because as it turns out, a bunch of employers, instead of looking at the individual criminal record of the person who's sitting in front of them, simply said, okay, well, there's a better shot that this black guy in front of me is a criminal than the white guy in front of me, just by looking at the criminality rates or jail rates, right, have previous criminal history rates in the two communities. Now, is that racism, or is that discrimination 1B, which is operating in the absence of individual information? I would say that's more discrimination 1B. That's operating in the absence of individual information. Sowell agrees. That's why he uses that term. Now, the reason that that matters with regard to the name study is because what the name study is it's an attempt to use culture as a stand-in for race. So what it is, okay, if I have somebody who has a quote-unquote culturally black name, right, which is to suggest that they maybe come from a neighborhood that is more impoverished, they may come from a culture that is less focused on certain priorities, then I'm going to use that as the stand-in for race. Now, that may be bad. Instead, what we would prefer is to look instead at the specifics of the resume. But there's another study that was done, and this sort of shows the converse, right? And that was, they looked at last names of black folks, like historically black last names. They looked at last names like Johnson, and what they saw was that if you actually just use historically black last names, there was no discrimination at all. So if you put the historically black names, last names, on resumes, and you sent them in, and you put historically white last names, or Jewish last names, Greenstein or something, on a resume, they would get hired at precisely the same rates, because people were actually using the name as a stand-in for information they felt that they did not have. It wasn't that they were instead suggesting, okay, all black people are out. So that's kind of fascinating. This is not to suggest that there's no racism in American life. There certainly is, but we have to point to specific instances of racism and be very exact about where we're accusing people of racism and where we're simply accusing people of using the best information possible. And if the only information that's possible that they are using is group information, we have to make a better effort as a society to ensure that people can get better individualized information so they can judge on the basis of individual identity as opposed to group identity.
So it could be discrimination but not racism.
Right.
Thank you.